Hello everyone! Today's joke of the day is, what do you use to mend a jack-o'-lantern? Stay tuned to find out. Our learning targets today are I can know and memorize my perfect squares, and I can solve an equation when a variable is squared. So just a quick definition, a perfect square is the result of multiplying an integer by itself. Okay, so we are going to list all the perfect squares through 400. Starting with 1. Well, we know 1 squared is 1, 2 squared is 4, 3 squared is 9, 4 squared is 16, 5 squared is 25, 6 squared is 36, 7 squared, 49, 8 squared, 64, 9 squared, 81, 10 squared, 100, 11 squared, 121, 12 squared, 144, 13 squared, 169, 14 squared, 196, 15 squared, 225, 16 squared, 256, 17 squared, 289, 18 squared, 324, 19 squared, 361, and 20 squared is 400. So that's all of our perfect squares through 400. Make sure you can locate the squared button on your calculator so that you can figure out these squares later if you do not know them. Okay, now we are going to look at square roots. So we're going to find the square roots of the following perfect squares. For now, only list the positive answers. So the square root is the inverse operation of the square. Okay, so when we square something, the square root is going to be the inverse operation, so undoing that square. Okay, so the square root of 1, also for right now, we're only going to list the positive answers, and we'll talk about a little bit more about what that means in a little while. Okay, so the square root of 1 is 1, square root of 4, 2, square root of 9, 3, square root of 16, 4, square root of 25, 5, square root of 36, 6, square root of 49, 7, square root of 64, 8, square root of 81, 9, square root of 100, 10, square root of 121, 11, square root of 144 is 12, square root of 169 is 13, square root of 196 is 14, square root of 225 is 15, square root of 256 is 16, square root of 289 is 17, square root of 324 is 18, square root of 361 is 19, and square root of 400 is 20. Now, I had said at the beginning that we were only going to list the positive answers, okay? So let's take a look at a few of these and see what would happen if we use negative numbers. So the reason that we know that the square root of 9 equals 3 is because 3 times 3 gives us 9, okay? So those two numbers multiplied together are going to give us 9, okay? So 3 squared equals 9, so the square root of 9 equals 3. But there are also two other numbers that when you multiply them together, multiply it by itself. Or there's one other number, when you multiply it by itself, that also gives you 9. And that would be negative 3. Because if we took negative 3 times negative 3, that also equals 9, because a negative times a negative gives us a positive, and 3 times 3 equals 9. Okay, so we only list the positive answers, but there is a case where but for every square root, there are also two negative numbers that can multiply together to give you that number. Okay, so just so that you're aware of that and can be watching out for that. Now let's looking at solving some equations with an x squared, okay, with our variable squared. So this first equation, we have x squared equals 25, okay? Well, in order to get the x by itself, we have to do inverse operations, right? Okay, well, the inverse of squaring, like I said earlier, is taking the square root, okay? So we are going to take the square root of x squared, and since we do it on the left-hand side, we also have to do it on the right-hand side, okay? So this square root really acts like canceling out that squared, okay? So we are just left with x on the left-hand side equals, and then we have to think about the numbers that multiply to give us 25, a number that multiplies by itself to get us 25. So our answers are going to be positive 5, right? And negative 5. So we write this as plus or minus 5. Okay, that's how we say this, plus or minus 5. Okay, so this symbol here means that we have positive 5 and negative 5 as our solutions. Okay, so we can write our two solutions, there are two of them, as x equals plus or minus 5. Okay, so whenever we have a squared, we are always going to have two solutions. Okay, so let's look at the next one. We're going to take the square root of both sides to get that x all by itself. Okay, that's the inverse operation there. And we end up with x equals, well, the square root of 36 is 6 and negative 6. So we can put plus or minus 6. And that is our solution, our two solutions for this equation. Okay, then let's look at one more here. We have the square root, we could take the square root on both sides, okay? And the square root of x squared is just x, and the square root of 289 is 17 and negative 17. So we say plus or minus 17. Now we can also solve some equations that have squares in them, but are not alone, okay? So this is similar to when we want to isolate our variable, or like when we isolated the absolute value. So if we want to get x squared isolated, right, all by itself, we would first subtract 4 on both sides here for this problem, okay? And then we end up with x squared equals 9. Okay, at this point, we can now take the square root because our x squared is isolated, and then we can end up with our two solutions being x equals, the square root of 9 is positive 3 and negative 3. So we have x equals plus or minus 3. Okay. Oops. For the second one, we want to isolate x squared by adding 8 on both sides. So we would get x squared equals 400. Finally, we can solve by taking the square root on both sides to get that x squared, or x is equal to, well, the square root of 400 is positive and negative 20. Those are our two solutions for x squared minus 8 equals 392. Okay, finally, here we have this 3 out front of the x squared, so we can divide by 3 on both sides to solve to get that x squared is equal to 243 divided by 3, which is 81. And then if we take the square root both sides, we end up with x equals positive 9 and negative 9, because those are the square root. The square root of 81 is plus or minus 9. We can always check our answers just like we have done previously. Okay, so to check our answers for this one, we would substitute 9 back in for x, so we'd have 3 times 9 squared, and that equals, see if that equals 243. So 9 squared is 81, and then we have 3 times 81, so we have 3 times 81, and that equals 243. So we know that that one works. We could also do 3 times negative 9 squared, and that equals 3 times, well, negative 9 squared also equals 81. If you're plugging that in your calculator, make sure you put the parentheses around the negative so that your calculator knows that to do that operation first. Okay, and then 3 times 81 still gives us 243. So we have checked our solutions, and they both work. Now for the answer to your joke of the day, what do you use to mend a jack-o'-lantern? Well, you use a pumpkin patch. Thanks for watching and have a great day.